Throughout British history, there have been many men and women who ruled the nation with skill and defiance, but there have also been some monarchs who were known for their lack of confidence and strength. King George II is often overlooked when the topic of a good British king is debated, and he was someone who did possess rather good political judgment, but he was also someone who had an alarming lack of self-confidence. But what is not as well known about George II is the fact that he was the final British king to have his remains embalmed in the same way which had been used for centuries inside of the land. The heart and internal organs were removed. The body cavity was then stuffed with spices to keep away decay, and the removed organs were then placed inside of a visceral urn, a box stored away from the coffin. King Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour, was an example of this. Her heart was removed after her death and then was buried inside of Hampton Court Palace's Chapel Royal, but her body was buried inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor. After his death, King George II's remains were placed in a burial vault within Westminster Abbey. But this has been opened a number of times, and it has even been said that his remains were in remarkable condition. But what is the story of the disturbance of George II's coffin? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. King George II grew up in Hanover, and he married in 1705 the beautiful Caroline of Ansbach. His father was made the British king, and with this, George Augustus, as he was known, became the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. But George I hated his son, and they had argued for many years in public. Prince George's house in London, known as Leicester House, eventually became a place where dissenting politicians, led by Sir Robert Walpole, would meet and discuss things, but George I and his son did eventually somehow reconcile slightly. But Prince George had a number of close friends who later became his ministers when he became the king. George II became king in 1727 following his father's death, and he did exercise little power over what happened inside of his nation, becoming the constitutional monarch that we have in Britain today. His reign and his rule was dominated by Parliament, and he would actually spend more time in Hanover during the summer, where he had more control and power, leaving the government to run England. George II also was the most recent British king to lead an army into battle at the Battle of Dettingen during the War of Austrian Succession, but he, like his father, had a difficult relationship with his son Frederick, who supported his opponents in Parliament, and George II spent a lot of time arguing with him. He also faced the final Jacobite rebellion as Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender, landed in Scotland, but he would be defeated following brief success at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. But as mentioned, much of his reign was categorised by political instability and infighting in the government, and during the final years of his reign, George II took a step back, and he had little interest in politics and seemingly let his government get on with running the country. He was a man who loved the military and armed forces and loved the idea of commanding troops in battle. However, he had no interest in reading or education or the arts and science, which were all flourishing at the time. He would have rather been out on his lands hunting or gambling money playing cards, and during his reign, British interests did expand throughout the world, but some people consider George a rather faintly ludicrous king, and many have criticised him. Other historians have considered that he did the right thing with regards to the running of Britain. As one stated, "With him our laws and liberties were safe. He possessed in a great degree of confidence of his people and the respect of foreign governments, and a certain steadiness of character made him of great consequence in these unsettled times. His character would not afford subject for epic poetry, but will look well in the sober page of history. By the October of 1760, King George II was suffering with his health. He was blind in one eye and could not hear very well, and on the 25th of October he woke up at roughly 6 a.m. and had his usual cup of hot chocolate to begin the day. He then went to the toilet, but a loud crash was heard minutes later, and his valet entered the room to see the king unconscious on the floor. It was claimed that King George II, he appeared to have just come from his necessary stall, as if he was going to open his escritoire, a small piece of furniture. George II was taken to his bed, and Princess Amelia was sent for. However, by the time she got there, the king was already dead, and he was almost 77 years old, the longest living king of Britain at the time. Following his death, his body was subjected to embalming in the same manner that had happened before for centuries. He was the final monarch to have his remains dealt with in this manner, and following his death, surgeons made a large cut into his chest, and they studied his remains and concluded that he died of a thoracic aortic dissection, or a huge heart attack. The embalming process removed King George II's heart and his other internal organs. These were then placed inside of a visceral urn, a separate pot for his remains to be kept out of his coffin during burial. This was done to ensure that the remains did not decay quickly, and the chest cavity was then filled with perfumes after being washed and other spices to try and keep away decay. After this was done, the body of George II was wrapped in a thick cloth known as cerecloth, a wax-coated shroud that would keep his body preserved. Some cerecloths have been found to have been so effective that even the remains of kings who died 700 years ago are remarkably still preserved today. King George II was also the final monarch to be buried inside of Westminster Abbey. His funeral and burial took place on the 11th of November 1760, and his coffin was carried in through the north door of the abbey. And he had left instructions for his remains to be placed with his wife's coffin, but strangely, so that the sides of the coffins could be removed, so that they could not be entombed in a shell, but instead to be open to the elements, so they could, in a strange, but I suppose sweet way, be closer to each other. This was a sweet idea, however. Because Westminster Abbey was getting rather full with the burials of kings and queens, work was done on a vault to contain the remains of George II. With regards to the funeral, it was said that the procession through a line of foot guards, every seventh man bearing a torch, the horse guards lining the outsides, their officers with drawn sabres and crape sashes on horseback, the drums muffled, the fifes, bells tolling, and minutes guns. All this was very solemn. Following the funeral procession, which was done under torchlight, people pushed forwards to get a decent view of the burial vault in which King George II would be interred inside of. People began to sit and stand where they could to get a good view, and the yeomen of the guard, who were carrying the king's heavy coffin, asked for help to clear a path. There was a lack of decorum with this burial, and there was later even reports during the procession about deaths of people who had been crushed. A series of vaults under Westminster Abbey, it's believed, were constructed opposite the tomb of King Edward VI in 1728, after George II came onto the throne, and he had probably intended one of these being his resting place. A larger vault under the central part of King Henry VII's Lady Chapel was created, and work was done very quickly on this in 1737. The floor of the chapel was removed and a deep excavation was done, with a stone complex being constructed with different chambers for members of the royal family. This work was completed when George III's queen had died and she was interred here. It was here where King George II was buried, and a black marble bronze-handled double sarcophagus at the eastern end of this vault housed the bodies of the King, George II, and his Queen. In this sarcophagus, the coffins of George II and Queen Caroline did have their sideboards removed, so they were closer in death. The visceral chests containing the removed heart and internal organs of the King and Queen were also placed at the side on a shelf, and these were noted to have been leather-covered boxes. Now, as this vault was so large in its construction, it allowed other members of the royal family over the decades to be buried alongside George II, and this included Henry Frederick, the Duke of Cumberland, who was laid to rest in 1790. There is today no large tomb or monument to the King inside of Westminster Abbey, just a small inscription on the white floor tile that says, King George II, 1760. But this burial vault has been opened a number of times and has been investigated. In 1871, the vault was opened, and then in 1943, Dean Labriere opened the vault and he assessed the contents of the vault. He looked at George II's remains and Queen Caroline's, and he noted that they were scarcely any signs of decay, showing that the embalming process had worked very well in this case. Today, kings and queens are not embalmed in the way that King George II was. He was the final monarch to have this sort of treatment after death, and it was done to preserve the body in the hope of one day the monarch resurrecting. Internal organs were removed to keep the body as fresh as it could be and to prevent rotting from within, but still today the embalmed corpse of George II sits under the floor of Westminster Abbey in a stone vault with the side of the coffin open. Thousands of people visit the Abbey every single day, and they walk past the site where George's vault is. I personally myself have walked past it, not realising that beneath my feet are the remains of King George II. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.